It was many years later, at the Council of Constantinople, the year 381 AD, the words of 1 Corinthians 15 were added to the Nicene Creed as a way of expressing these essential teachings of the Christian church. There we hear it almost word for word. What Paul says is of first importance, that Christ was crucified, also for us under Pontius Pilate. He suffered, was buried. The third day he rose again, according to Scriptures. Well, Paul doesn't mention Pontius Pilate, but he insists already at the beginning of this letter to the Corinthian churches that he preaches nothing else except Christ and Him crucified. He calls it a stumbling block to the Jews who thought a person hung on a tree was cursed by God. Foolishness to the Greeks who figured, why are you worshiping a dead man? But to those being saved, he said, it's the power of God and the wisdom of God. This is the essential teaching that Paul says he received in verse 3. And it became for the Christian church an essential teaching to be passed on from generation to generation. And that's why we preach it today. That's why I'm preaching it today, especially at Easter, because not unlike that first generation of Christians, our culture and our world offers alternatives to faith that is anchored in an event in history. Although I can say with Paul, so I preach, I cannot always say that's what you believe. If someone were to ask you, what is the central teaching of Christianity, what would you say? Would you find yourself talking about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ? Would talk of His death include that His death was for us, sinners? Would talk of His resurrection be the foundation for that trust in you that you also will live eternally? You see, Paul was able to add something that most of us cannot. Paul claimed, as proof of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that the risen Christ had appeared to him. If you make such a claim today, you would probably be viewed as something of an unstable person. Perhaps your friends would be a little more cautious to be around you. You might find yourself isolated from the mainstream of society, or maybe people would simply dismiss you. What kind of simple person are you? How limited is your intellect? You live in a world where you're not quite in touch with reality. Thank God for Thomas. Thank God for Thomas. He said right up front, he would not believe unless he saw for himself the nail scars in Jesus' hands, and unless he put his fingers into the wounded side where the spear had pierced him. When the risen Christ appeared to Thomas, he spoke words of blessing. Blessed are those who believe, but who have not seen. You can read about that in the Gospel of John, chapter 20. It seems to me that in our day, we have several alternatives to anchoring our faith in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. There were early Christians who denied the death of Christ. They said at the last minute, God had substituted Judas on the cross. Fair, isn't it? Jesus stood by, rather enjoying the trick that had been played on those who had been trying to kill him. Do you realize that's basically the teaching that was taken up by Islam? Muslims insist that they honor Jesus. Perhaps they honor him even more than Christians do, they'd say, because they deny his death on the cross. Now, I visit the Islamic Center up the street. I have friends there, people who I have known for many years. I consider them to be doing wonderful work among their people. But when they tell me Islam is like Christianity because they teach about Jesus, I'm careful to say to any Christians who are around, they do not teach what we teach about Jesus. First, they do not teach the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. And second, they certainly do not see in Jesus the incarnation of God. Remember the words of John, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He's a good man, perhaps even a prophet, but in no way divine. And to debate what they mean and what we mean by the words Son of God, that's a whole topic of its own. But they don't mean what we mean.